I don't know about you, but I feel so inspired to be here, and very grateful to Eric and to Gary Bowles and everyone else who was kind enough to include me in this. You know, I want to talk about some themes that the previous distinguished speakers have also discussed. You know, we tend to think of advances in medicine as being a new drug, a new laser, something really high-tech and expensive. And we often have a hard time believing that the simple choices that we make in our lives each day, like what we eat, how we respond to stress, how much exercise we get, and perhaps most important, how much love and intimacy that we have in our lives, that these simple choices can make such a powerful difference, but they do. And what we find that is if we can address the underlying cause of a problem, if we can turn off the faucet around the sink that's overflowing and not just simply mop up the floor, that our bodies have a remarkable capacity to begin healing themselves, and much more quickly than we had once realized. And in this sense that lifestyle can not only be preventing diseases, but actually treating them, sometimes with drugs, sometimes in place of drugs, sometimes more effectively than drugs. And everything that I'm going to talk with you about this morning was thought impossible just a few years ago. And so we're able to show, for example, that even severe heart disease can actually begin to be reversed simply by making changes in diet and lifestyle. Which you look at the upper left as a narrowing in one of the arteries in the heart. A year later, it's less clogged. Usually goes in the other direction. And the PET scan shown in the bottom left before the blue and black is no blood flow. A year later, orange and white is maximal. Show this kind of improvement and how dramatic it is. And we found that when we looked at all the arteries in all the patients in a randomized controlled trial, that the arteries got more and more clogged from beginning to 1 year to 5 years in the group that made more conventional changes in lifestyle, that they got less and less clogged. And I think these findings are giving many people new hope and new choices that we didn't have before. I want to show you what this looks like in a real patient.
I'm no longer using a cane or a wheelchair. In November of 2001, I was using a cane to walk with, and I had to have the humiliating experience of riding a wheelchair around Walmart. Now, I didn't like that. I wasn't going to settle for that. I knew there must be a better way. And thank God I found a better way. I no longer have to take my diabetes medication. In fact, my total medication has been reduced by 75%. I had trouble getting to my mailbox without having chest pain. But now I am walking at least 2 miles a day. I ride my stationary bike anywhere from 8 to 10 miles a day.
So, you know, this is not a best case. This is representative of what happens when people change their lifestyle. It's why I'm so passionate about doing this work, because I've worked with thousands and thousands of people like this, and they don't know how much better they can get. So then we did a study to see whether or not we could affect the progression of early-stage prostate cancer, which we did in collaboration with the chair of urology at UCSF and the chair of urology at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. And what we found was that the PSA levels, which is a marker for prostate cancer, went down in the group that made these changes, went up in the group that didn't, in direct proportion to the degree of change, just like we found in the cardiac studies. The more people change, the more they improve. We found that tumor growth was inhibited by 70% in vitro in the experimental group compared to the control group was only 9%. Also, the more people changed their lifestyle, the more it directly inhibited the tumor growth. And then we did MR spectroscopy scans, which are shown here, and the tumor activity is shown in red, which after just a year begins to diminish. So we wondered, how is it that people can get better so quickly? And so we looked at their gene expression. You know, so often people say, oh, it's all in my genes, what can I do? Well, it turns out you can actually do a lot. We found that after just 3 months of making these lifestyle changes, over 500 genes were beneficially affected. And in fact, turning on the good genes that prevent disease and turning off the genes that promote disease, particularly the oncogenes that promote breast, prostate, and colon cancer, which are shown here in what's called a heat map. Red is turned on. You can see it's mostly red at the beginning. And each one of those down here, these are all different genes that promote cancer that get turned off in just 3 months. And so this idea that our genes are our destiny is really not true. Our genes are not our fate, and we can change that. And when you change the expression of your genes, it actually gets transmitted to your kids as well, what's called epigenetics. Now, We then did a study with Dr. Liz Blackburn, who got the Nobel Prize last year for discovering telomerase, which is an enzyme that repairs and lengthens damaged telomeres, which are the ends of our chromosomes that control how long we live. And she did a study and found that women who were taking care of kids with autism or parents with Alzheimer's who were under chronic stress, the more stress they felt and the longer they felt stress, the lower their telomerase and the shorter their telomeres. It was the first study showing on a genetic level that chronic stress can actually shorten your lifespan. So we were presenting at a conference. I said, well, if bad things make your telomeres shorter, maybe good things make them longer. And sure enough, we found that after just 3 months that the telomerase increased by almost 30%. And we just got some data, which we're about to publish, showing that the telomere lengths increased as well. And even pharma hasn't yet been shown to do this. So what have we learned about what enables people to make sustainable changes? And it's not what I thought when I first started doing this work 35 years ago. It's not fear of dying, it's joy of living. And if we go back, can we go backwards a few slides? There we go. There we go, right there. This goes back to the first dietary intervention, you know, when God said, don't eat the apple, and that didn't work very well, and that was God talking. And so I've learned that even more than being healthy, people want to feel free and in control. And as soon as I tell somebody, don't eat this and do that, they immediately want to do the opposite. And if you tell kids, for example, that smoking is bad for them, that just makes it cool, like James Dean on a Harley. And so we have to take a different approach. And part of what we've learned is that, you know, just telling people they're going to live longer doesn't really make a difference. The fortune teller says, I give smokers a discount because there's not as much to tell. That's the fear-based approach that doesn't work. And if you go on a diet, then sooner or later you're going to go off a diet, you know, because diets don't work. They're all about what you can't have and what you must do. And so what we've learned is that we can take a spectrum approach, that the more you change, the more you improve. It's not all or nothing. It's how you can personalize a way of eating and living. The more you change, the better you feel. The better that you feel, the more you want to keep doing it. And the more you keep wanting to do it, the more you improve. You get a virtuous cycle going. So you decide how much you want to change, how many things, how quickly. We support that degree of change. And if that's enough, great. If not, you can do more. It's radically simple. Here's a little clip that we put together that talks about this. So it's not all or nothing. If you go on a diet, you're going to go off a diet. Fear and failure are built into it. This way, do what you can. It's a much more compassionate approach. Now, what we've learned is that what's sustainable is feeling good, is feeling pleasure and joy. And when you make these changes, your brain gets so much more blood flow, you begin to think more clearly, you have more energy, you need less sleep. You know, your skin gets more blood, so you don't age as quickly. Your heart gets more blood, you can reverse heart disease. And you can actually grow so many new brain cells that your brain can get measurably bigger in just a couple of months. And it's not what you exclude from your diet that's harmful, it's also what you include that's beneficial. There are literally hundreds of thousands of substances, predominantly in fruits and vegetables and whole grains and so on, that have anti-cancer, anti-heart disease, even anti-aging properties. But some of my favorite substances actually promote neurogenesis. For example, chocolate and tea and blueberries can increase neurogenesis, whereas what's bad for your heart is bad for your brain, things like saturated fat, sugar, and nicotine. And a recent study came out just a couple of months ago that found that frequent sex actually increases neurogenesis, as do things like stress management, moderate exercise, and believe it or not, even cannabinoids increase neurogenesis. I'm just the messenger. What were we just talking about? Never mind. So let me just show you, this is one study that was done in rats where they actually compared rats who were forced to have, allowed to have sex, I should say, and those that were not, and found that just in a very short time, in about 14 days, they had significantly more neurogenesis, which is, what happened here? We ended up going forward to, there it is, showing the extra brain cells that can grow, how dynamic these are, and how quickly that can occur. Now, it turns out that there are a lot of health policy implications from this as well, that 75% of the $2.5 trillion in healthcare costs, what sometimes are really more likely sick care costs, are from chronic diseases that can be largely prevented or even reversed simply by making changes in diet and lifestyle. Now, it turns out that, we have a big debate going on about, the Democrats who want to raise taxes or let the deficit go up, Republicans who want to dismantle Medicare. It's at a loggerhead because neither choice is really very good. But when we realize that 3/4 of the cost of this $2.5 trillion are from things that our lifestyle changes can prevent or even reverse simply by making these changes, we have a third alternative. We can make true health care available at a fraction of the cost, and the only side effects are good ones. And nowhere is this easier to see than in cardiovascular disease, which kills more people than everything else combined, not only in this country, but now worldwide, because we have this globalization of chronic disease that's going on. Now, many people are surprised to learn that 95% of heart disease could be prevented today and even reversed, knowing what we know now. We don't need a new drug, we don't need a new laser, we don't need a new breakthrough. We simply need to put into practice what we already know. Now, many people are also surprised to find that the randomized trials show that bypass surgery and angioplasty and stents really don't prolong life or even prevent heart attacks for the vast majority of people who get them, unless you're in the middle of having one, which 95% of people who get them are not. And we spent $100 billion last year on these operations that are dangerous, invasive, expensive, and largely ineffective. So if we can focus on the lifestyle choices and realize that they work not only as well as drugs and surgery, but often even better at a fraction of the cost, and the only side effects are good ones. Now, we found, for example, that we did a demonstration project with Mutual of Omaha. They found that most people could avoid surgery. They saved $30,000 per patient in the first year. We did a second demonstration project with Highmark Blue Cross Blue Shield, where they found they cut their costs in half in the first year and by an additional 20 to 30% in years 2 and 3. We also, there we go. We did a study with, I also wanted to show you, this is one of my favorite anti-smoking ads that, if you tell somebody smoking causes lung cancer, heart attacks, it's just too horrible to hear about. People don't want to think about. Fear is not sustainable. But it turns out nicotine constricts the arteries in your body. So in your face, it makes you age faster. In your heart, it can cause a heart attack. In your brain, it can cause a stroke. But half of guys who smoke are impotent. So when you tell people that, the advertising says that smoking makes you beautiful and sexy, it really makes you ugly and impotent, that puts it much more into the present tense. And is much more effective at getting kids not to smoke than telling them that something bad will happen to them 30 years down the road, which they don't want to think about. Now, it turns out that because these costs are so high and because they're modifiable, that we can make these changes and we can give a third alternative to what we've been doing before. And what's good for you is good for the planet. There's a sense of feeling overwhelmed at these crises that we're facing. But when we realize that livestock consumption causes more global warming than all forms of transportation combined, what we choose to eat each day makes a difference not only in our own lives, but in the lives of our planet as well. And as other countries are beginning to eat like us and live like us and die like us, these are global phenomena that we can do something about as well. Now, we finally, and by the way, if you're interested in this stuff, we have a lot of free meditations and information on our website, just at ornish.com. Now, what I'm most interested in is not simply saving money. We were finally able to get Medicare to cover our program after 17 years of going back and forth. That I used to think that science was the primary determinant of medical practice, and I've learned that science is important, but reimbursement is a much more powerful driver. And so if we can change reimbursement, we can change not only medical practice, but also medical education. And that we need to work at a deeper level. You know, I'd ask people, why do you smoke? Why do you overeat? Why do you drink too much? Why do you work too hard? These behaviors seem so maladaptive to me. And they'd say, you don't get it, Dean. These behaviors are very adaptive because they help us get through the day. They say things like, I've got 20 friends in this package of cigarettes, and they're always there for me, and nobody else is. You're going to take away my 20 friends? What are you going to give me? Or they say that food fills the void, or alcohol numbs the pain, or working all the time numbs the pain, or video games numb the pain, or spending too much time surfing the web numbs the pain. We have lots of ways of numbing, killing, bypassing, distracting ourselves from pain. But pain isn't the problem. Pain is the motivator. Pain gets our attention. It says, hey, listen up, pay attention. You're not doing something that's in your best interest. And if we just literally or figuratively bypass the problem without also treating the underlying cause, the problem comes back again, or we get a new set of problems, or we have painful choices. And so what we're learning is that at the root of so many of these behaviors is the sense of loneliness and isolation. The real epidemic isn't just heart disease or cancer, it's loneliness, depression, isolation, with the breakdown of the social networks that used to give us a sense of connection and community. And I wrote a book called Love and Survival about 12 years ago where I reviewed hundreds of studies that show that people who feel lonely and depressed are 3 to 10 times more likely to get sick and die prematurely than those who have a sense of love and connection and community. In part because you're more likely to abuse yourself, in part through other mechanisms that we don't fully understand. One study showed, for example, that people with heart disease who were depressed 6 months after a heart attack were 5 times more likely to be dead than those who weren't. And when you're depressed, your immune system is depressed. HIV-positive men and women in San Francisco who were depressed had more than double the likelihood of dying from AIDS than those who weren't. But they've also shown that we can do something about that. David Spiegel did a classic study of women with metastatic breast cancer, and he found that when he brought them together in a support group once a week for just an hour and a half in a supportive, safe environment to talk about what was really going on in their lives, and just did that for a year, once a week for a year, 5 years later, those women lived twice as long. Now, a skeptic might say, come on, give me a break. You mean talking about my feelings, at a group of women who've got cancer is going to help me live longer? Please. But that's what the studies show, because we are creatures of community. The need for connection and community is really the unmet human need. And if you can meet that even badly, you can create a multi-billion-dollar business, like the lounges in Starbucks or the chat rooms in AOL or Facebook. But if you can do it more intentionally, we can really create a real sense of community. And to me, the ancient spiritual teachings, were all about anything that brings us together is really healing. The root healing comes from the root to make whole. The word yoga comes from the Sanskrit, to yoke, to unite, to bring together. And Aldous Huxley talked about the perennial philosophy of altruism, compassion, love, and forgiveness, because these are things that connect us, that keep us from our own suffering. It's the false choice that Professor Reich was talking about. Am I going to be for me or am I going to be for other people? We realize, as Nelson Mandela said when he was released from jail, do you still hate your jailers? And he said, well, if I did, then I'm still in prison. When I can have that sense of forgiveness, it frees me. It doesn't condone what they've done, but it frees me from the suffering. And so ultimately, the ancient swamis and rabbis and priests and monks and nuns didn't develop these techniques to unclog their arteries or lower their blood pressure or do all these things. They can do that, but we're all going to die. The mortality rate is still 100%. It's 1 per person. So to me, the more interesting question is not how long we live, but how well we live. And that we can use the experience of suffering as a doorway for transforming our lives. That anything that takes us from the I, of isolated, separate, to the me, the we. If we can go back one slide to the we. Oops, sorry, go forward one slide then. Can really give a sense of community and connection, which is ultimately what frees us from our own suffering. And in that sense, as Mayor Booker said, it's a conspiracy of love. If I went to Medicare and said, I want to create these oases of safety where people can get together and open their hearts and let down their emotional defenses and rediscover inner sources of peace and joy, they'd say, you're out of here, buddy. But if we can show them the quantitative arteriograms and the cardiac PET scans, and for every $1 they spend, they save 3 more, then even then it took us 17 years, but we were able to get it done. And to me, that's what really makes this matter, is that we can help people. Change is hard. But if we're in enough pain and we can help people guide them at a time when they're suffering, suddenly the idea of change becomes more interesting. And they often say things like, having a heart attack was the best thing that ever happened to me. You say, what, are you nuts? They say, no, that's what it took to get my attention to begin making these changes that have transformed my life in ways that go beyond just living longer to living better. Thank you so much.